She said, "This farm has been in your family for 3 generations, Earl. Sign it over to us, or we'll make sure everyone in this county knows you can't manage your own affairs anymore." I looked at my daughter-in-law across the kitchen table, my grandfather built in 1959, and I said, "That's interesting, Renee, because the sheriff's office has been waiting on my call for about 3 weeks now." She went very still. "My name is Earl Whitfield. I'm 58 years old. I live on 340 acres outside of Amarillo, Texas, and I have spent the better part of my adult life doing things the slow, honest way. Got up before sunrise, fed the cattle, fixed what broke, paid what I owed. I am not a complicated man. I don't have a lot of patience for people who think cleverness is the same thing as intelligence, and I have zero patience for people who confuse an old man's quiet for an old man's weakness. My late wife Barbara passed 4 years ago. Pancreatic cancer. 6 weeks from diagnosis to the end, which is how that particular disease tends to work, fast and without mercy. Before she left, she held my hand and said, "Earl, watch out for our boy. He's got my trusting heart, and that worries me more than anything." She wasn't wrong about that. Our son Ben has been trusting since the day he was born. It's one of the things that makes him a good man. It's also the thing that made him exactly the kind of person Renee Calloway was looking for when she walked into his life. I need to back up, because what happened on that October morning in my kitchen didn't start in October. It started 3 years before that, on the night Ben brought Renee home to meet me for the first time. Ben is 32. He works as an agricultural equipment technician out of Amarillo, drives a service truck, knows every combine and irrigation system in the panhandle by feel. Honest work. Good money. He's got Barbara's eyes and my stubbornness, which is both a blessing and something that has caused me considerable inconvenience over the years. He called me on a Thursday in March and said, "Dad, I've been seeing someone for about 4 months. I'd like you to meet her." I said, "Bring her Sunday." He said, "Don't be weird about it." I said, "I'm never weird." He made a sound that I will generously describe as skeptical. They pulled up Sunday at noon. Ben got out first. Renee got out second, and she did it the way someone does when they've thought about how they're going to get out of a car. Deliberate. Composed. She was put together in a way that felt effortful, if that makes sense. Everything just slightly too coordinated. She shook my hand and said, "Mr. Whitfield, Ben talks about this place constantly. It's even more beautiful than he described." And then she looked out at the land, the flat stretching acreage, the winter wheat stubble, the old red barn my father painted when I was 7, and her eyes did something. Not appreciation. Calculation. I've been around enough livestock buyers and land speculators to know the difference between a person admiring something and a person appraising it. I didn't say any of that to Ben. Instead, I made brisket. I poured iced tea. I asked Renee the kinds of questions a father asks, and I listened to the gaps between her answers more than the answers themselves. She was vague about her family. She was vague about her work, something in real estate consulting, which could mean anything or nothing. She was specific, very specific about property values. She mentioned 3 times, in 3 different ways, how land prices in the Texas Panhandle had doubled in 8 years. She asked if I'd ever thought about selling. I said, "No." She smiled and said, "Of course not, it's your home." But she said it the way people say things they're planning to revisit. After they left, I sat on the porch for a long time. Barbara used to sit out there with me, on Sunday evenings, just the 2 of us watching the sky change color, not needing to say much. I sat out there alone and thought about what I'd seen. And I called my neighbor Hank, who'd been ranching adjacent land for 30 years and had seen every variety of land grab scheme imaginable. I said, "Hank, hypothetically, how does a person try to take a working ranch from someone who isn't looking to sell?" Hank didn't laugh. He'd been through enough to know there's no such thing as a hypothetical question when you use that tone of voice. He said, "You got time? Because the list is longer than you'd think." I said, "I've got all evening." He gave me 2 hours and a story about his own cousin, who'd nearly lost 200 acres in New Mexico to a scheme involving forged power of attorney documents and a fake conservatorship filing. He said, "The people who do this, Earl, they're not dumb. They pick targets who have assets and no one watching the door closely." I said, "Someone's watching my door." He said, "Good, keep it that way." Ben and Renee got engaged 14 months later. I hugged my son and told him I loved him and meant every word of that. I spent the drive home thinking about Barbara's voice. He's got my trusting heart. I called my attorney, a woman named Adele Sorrells who'd handled every piece of land business on this property for 15 years, first for my father and then for me. I told her I wanted to talk about a revocable transfer on death deed and whether there was a stronger instrument available to me. She said, "Earl, what's going on?" I said, "Nothing yet. That's why I'm calling now." She was quiet for a moment. "Come in Wednesday. We'll talk about an agricultural land trust." 2 weeks later, I sat in Adele's office in Amarillo and signed documents that placed all 340 acres, the farmhouse, the barn, the water rights, and every piece of titled equipment on the property into a land trust. I was named the sole trustee. I retained all operational control, all income rights, all decision-making authority during my lifetime. Any attempt to transfer, encumber, lien, or sell any portion of the trust assets required my written authorization as trustee, notarized, with a mandatory 5-business-day review window. Any instrument filed without following that exact procedure was legally void from the moment of filing. Adele slid the papers across to me and said, "This is about as solid as Texas property law allows. Anyone trying to work around this is going to find themselves in front of a judge explaining a felony." I signed. I didn't tell Ben. I put the documents in the fireproof safe in my office that Ben had known existed since he was 12 and never once shown any interest in. Then I went home and kept watching. The wedding was in May, small ceremony, outdoor, at a venue east of town with a white tent and string lights, and a view of nothing but flat land and big sky, which is all the view anyone needs in the Panhandle if you know how to look at it. Ben wore a gray suit. He cried a little during the vows, which he gets from Barbara, and has never once been ashamed of. Renee was composed throughout. She said her lines clearly and correctly. She held Ben's hand and smiled at the guests and smiled at the camera and smiled at me. You know what I noticed? When the photographer asked them to look at each other, just each other, candid, natural, Renee's eyes drifted. Not to another person, to the land. To the open acreage visible past the tent's edge. It was a half second. Most people wouldn't have caught it. I caught it because I'd been watching her eyes for 14 months. I danced with Ben at the reception. He said, "Dad, I know you had reservations. I just want you to know she makes me happy." I said, "Then that matters." He looked at me with those Barbara eyes and said, "That's not a ringing endorsement." I said, "It's the truest thing I can say right now." He nodded slowly. He's smarter than people give him credit for. He filed that away. I drove home and called Hank. I said, "Keep your ears open." He said, "Already am." I didn't know then how fast things would move. Renee's mother, a woman named Dolores, called me 6 weeks after the wedding. I'd met Dolores twice. At the engagement dinner and at the reception. Both times, she had the same quality as her daughter. Pleasant on the surface and watchful underneath. She said she was calling to say hello, to say how happy she was about the marriage, and then, casually, "The way you mentioned something you've been waiting to mention," she said. "Earl, Ben mentioned that the property isn't in any kind of formal estate plan. Have you thought about making sure he's protected if something were to happen to you?" I said, "Dolores, I appreciate the concern. Everything's taken care of." She said, "Of course. You're so responsible. I just know how complicated ranch estates can get without proper planning." I said, "I've had a good attorney for 20 years. Nothing's complicated." There was a small pause. Then she said, "Well, that's wonderful, just wonderful," and changed the subject. I hung up and sat with that conversation for a while. Then I called Adele and told her about it. She said she was fishing. I said, "I know." Adele said, "I'm going to do some background research on Renee Calloway. No charge, just let me look." I said, "Look hard." Adele called me back in 4 days. What she found was not nothing. Renee had worked for 3 years as a licensed real estate agent in Oklahoma, where her license had been placed on probationary status after a complaint involving an elderly client, whose property had been listed and sold without adequate disclosure of an existing lien. The complaint had been settled quietly. No criminal charges, but the license was restricted and Renee had moved to Texas shortly after. In Texas, she'd set up a sole proprietor consulting business. No partners, No clients visible in any public record, no BBB listing, nothing. What there was: 2 LLCs registered in her name in the past 18 months, one in New Mexico, one in Texas. Both registered at addresses that turned out to be mail forwarding services. Adele said, "None of this is proof of anything criminal yet. But the pattern is familiar to me. These LLCs, the background, the timing. Earl, I think you need to talk to someone at the Randall County DA's office," I said. "Not yet." She paused. "How not yet are we talking?" I said. "I want her to play it out. I want her to file something." Adele was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "You understand that if she files something fraudulent, that's when it becomes a crime we can act on." I said, "That's exactly what I'm waiting for." Another pause. "Earl Whitfield, you are a patient man." I said, "I'm a rancher. Patient is all I know how to be." I started building a file. Nothing dramatic. I kept notes, dates, quotes, anything that felt off. I got a friend of mine, a retired title officer named Sam Greer, who'd worked in Amarillo for 22 years, to quietly monitor any new filings associated with my property address. Sam had seen every variety of title fraud in the Texas Panhandle. He said, "I'll set up an alert. Anything touches that parcel, you'll know before the ink is dry." I said, "That's all I need." And I want to be careful about how I say this. I reached out through a mutual acquaintance to a woman in Lubbock, whose elderly father had nearly lost a small cotton farm to a scheme involving a manipulated durable power of attorney 2 years earlier. The case had gone to trial. The details were public record. I read every page of the trial transcript. The mechanism was almost identical to what I suspected Renee was building toward. Manufacture a paper trail suggesting the landowner had agreed to a transfer. File quickly before anyone looked too closely. Move the property before the victim understood what had happened. The difference in that Lubbock case was that the family had caught it 3 days after filing. In my case, nothing had been filed yet. I intended to know the minute it was. Sam called me on a Tuesday in September at 7:14 in the morning. I was already outside checking on a section of fence on the north pasture. My phone buzzed in my coat pocket. I looked at the screen. "Sam." I answered it, and he said, "Earl." His voice had that particular flatness that means the thing you were worried about just happened. "Something was filed yesterday with the county clerk. Warranty deed. Names you as grantor. Renee Whitfield and one of her LLCs as grantees." I sat down on the fence rail. "Sam, I know, I didn't sign a warranty deed." "I know you didn't, Earl. The notary stamp on it, I've seen that stamp before. There's a guy who's been doing notarizations for cash, no questions asked. His commission was challenged in a civil matter in Potter County last spring. Get me a certified copy, already requested. Pick it up this afternoon." I said, "Don't mention this to anyone." He said, "I've been in this business since before you were running cattle. You think this is the first time I've kept my mouth shut?" I picked up the copy, drove straight to Adele's office. She looked at it for about 30 seconds. Then she looked up and said, "Forged signature, compromised notary, and the trust structure makes it void regardless." "But Earl, she's filed it. That's the crime." I said, "I know." She said, "We need to go to law enforcement." I said, "Give me 2 weeks." She looked at me steadily. 2 weeks, she said, not 3. Over those 2 weeks, I finished the file. Sam helped me pull the chain of title on both her LLCs and trace their connections. One of the LLCs, as it turned out, had been listed as the receiving entity in a nearly identical scheme in Smith County the previous year, where an 80-year-old widow had nearly signed over mineral rights to her late husband's land before her niece caught the paperwork and raised hell. That case was still open. The investigator on it was a woman named Hendricks at the Texas Rangers Financial Crimes Division. She had been, I was told, looking for a second instance of the same LLC to build a pattern of conduct case. I gave her 3 instances. I drove to Amarillo and sat down with Ranger Hendricks and a Randall County assistant DA named Fowler. I brought the file. It was 53 pages, tabbed, indexed, color-coded by transaction. Adele had written the cover summary. I walked them through every page. When I finished, Fowler looked at Hendricks and said, "How often do civilian complainants walk in here with something this organized?" Hendricks said, "Almost never." She looked at me. "Mr. Whitfield, how long have you been building this?" I said, "Since the Sunday I first met her." She nodded slowly. "When do you think she'll make her move?" I said, She's already made it. She's got the fraudulent deed filed. The next step is finding a buyer and moving fast before anyone checks the title closely. Fowler said, "Do you think she'll come to you directly?" I thought about it. She'll want to look me in the face when she tells me it's done. People like her need to see it land. Hendricks said, "Then we'll be ready when she does." She was right about the timing. It was 11 days. It was a Monday, clear and cold the way October mornings get in the Texas Panhandle when the wind comes down off the caprock with nothing to slow it. I was in the kitchen when I heard two cars come down the long gravel drive. I didn't go to the window. I poured a second cup of coffee and sat down at the table my grandfather made in 1959, solid oak, scarred from 50 years of use, and I waited. The knock was firm. 3 times. I walked through my house, past the framed photographs of 3 generations on that land, past Barbara's reading chair that I still haven't moved, to the front door, and I opened it. Renee stood on the porch in a blazer and pressed slacks, hair neat, posture composed. Behind her was a man in a suit I didn't recognize. Later I'd learn he was a title agent working with her LLC buyer, and behind him, looking like he hadn't slept in several days, was my son. Ben wouldn't meet my eyes. I looked at him and I understood immediately. He had found out. Not all of it maybe, but enough. He was standing there because she'd made him come, and he hadn't yet figured out how to refuse, and he was ashamed of being in that driveway, and he was hoping I'd see that. I saw it. Renee said, "Earl, can we come in? There's something important we need to discuss with you about the property." I said, "Sure, come on in." We stood in my kitchen. The title agent put a leather folder on my grandfather's table. Ben stood near the back door with his arms crossed, not looking at anyone. Renee folded her hands in front of her and said, "Earl, I want to be straightforward with you. Ben and I have had an opportunity come up that we've decided to move forward on. We've had the property appraised, and we've entered into a purchase agreement with a buyer. The sale will close in about 6 weeks. We've been looking at some really beautiful retirement communities. There's one in Canyon, one closer to Lubbock, and honestly the one in Canyon has a wonderful program and the staff to resident ratio is." I held up one hand. She stopped. I said, "Renee." She waited. I said, "This farm has been in my family for 3 generations. My grandfather broke this ground in 1931. My father ran cattle on it for 40 years. I've worked it for 30. It is in an irrevocable land trust that I established 18 months ago, meaning it cannot be sold, transferred, or encumbered without my written authorization as trustee, notarized, with a 5-business-day review period. Any instrument filed without that procedure is void, not contested. Void, as in it never existed legally." I paused. "The warranty deed you filed last month with a forged signature of mine and a notary stamp from a man whose commission is under challenge in Potter County, that deed is void. The purchase agreement with your LLC buyer is void. The entire transaction does not legally exist." The title agent looked up from his folder. Ben made a sound I hadn't heard from him since he was 12 years old, and broke a window with a baseball and tried to hide it. Renee's composure didn't crack all at once. It went the way lake ice goes in early spring, one fracture spreading slowly into several. She said, "Earl, I think you're confused about the paperwork." I said, "I'm not confused about anything. I've been watching you since the first Sunday you sat in this house, and looked at my land like you were figuring out what it would sell for. I've been building a file for 2 years, 53 pages, tabbed and indexed. Ranger Hendricks at the Texas Financial Crimes Division has had it for 11 days. I looked at the title agent. I'd recommend you think carefully about your involvement." He picked up his folder and stepped back. I looked at Renee. "Here's what's going to happen now. I'm going to text a ranger who has been parked at the end of my driveway for the last 40 minutes, and she's going to come inside and ask you some questions that you're going to want a lawyer present for." Renee said, "You're making a mistake." I said, "The mistake was made when you filed a forged document with the Randall County clerk. Everything since then has just been waiting." I sent the text. Ranger Hendricks knocked on my open front door 2 minutes later and stepped into my kitchen. She was unhurried and precise, the way competent people always are when they've had 11 days to prepare for the exact thing that is currently happening. She said, "Ms. Whitfield, I'm Ranger Hendricks, with the Texas DPS Financial Crimes Division. I have some questions for you. I'd like you to come with me. She said it the way she'd probably said it 100 times, without drama, without raised voice, the way you say a thing when you know it's already decided. Renee looked at me. Then she looked at Ben. Ben had moved away from the back door. He was standing in the middle of the kitchen now, and he was looking at her with an expression I had never seen on my son's face before in his life. It wasn't rage. It wasn't grief. It was the look of a person whose understanding of the last 2 years has just collapsed and reformed into an entirely different shape. He didn't say a word to her. He just stepped aside so Ranger Hendricks had a clear path. That was enough. The title agent identified himself voluntarily to Hendricks and provided his documentation before she asked him to. He'd been hired through Renee's LLC and had not known the deed was fraudulent, which Adele later told me his attorney was going to argue, and probably successfully. Renee was placed under arrest in my kitchen, at my grandfather's table, on a Monday morning in October with the panhandle wind coming through the window I'd left cracked. She kept talking on the way out, firm, controlled, the voice of a person who hasn't yet accepted that the performance is over. The words got smaller as they got farther away. By the time the cruiser door shut, there was just the wind. Then it was Ben and me. He stood in the middle of the kitchen for a long time. I stood near the counter. Neither of us sat. Outside, the cattle were doing what cattle do, indifferent, slow-moving, unbothered by anything happening in the house. Ben said, "How long have you known?" I said, "I suspected from the first night. I had real evidence about 8 months after you were married." He said, "Why didn't you tell me?" I said, "Because you loved her, and because suspicion isn't the same as proof, and because I've watched enough men make irrevocable decisions in the middle of being told something they didn't want to hear, and I wasn't going to be the thing that pushed you wrong in either direction." He was quiet for a while. Then he said, "The land, it's still yours?" I said, "It was never hers to sell. The trust made the deed void from the second she filed it. This land is in the same position it was the day I signed those documents 18 months ago." He sat down at the table. He put his elbows on the oak surface his great-grandfather made, and he pressed his hands over his eyes, and I let him sit there because I know my son, and I know that he needs room to arrive at a thing in his own time. After a while he said, "She told me you'd agreed. She said you'd called her dad." "I don't have a dad." "She said you'd talked to a financial advisor together and decided that putting the property in both our names was the right estate planning move. She said you wanted it to be a surprise for my birthday." I said, "I know." He said, "I thought it was strange you didn't mention it." I said, "I know." He said, "I should have called you." I said, "Yes, but she knew you wouldn't because she told you not to ruin the surprise. That's how this works, Ben. They close every door you'd naturally walk through." He looked up. Those Barbara eyes, red at the edges, he said. "How'd she not know about the trust?" I said. "Because I didn't tell anyone except Adele and Hank. And because people who run this kind of scheme count on the fact that most people don't plan for it. Most people don't sit across from their son's girlfriend the first Sunday they meet her and feel something wrong," he said. "But you did," I said. "Your mother told me to watch." I listened. We sat at that table for a long time. I made coffee. I didn't push him toward any feeling or away from any other. Barbara taught me that. You can't pull a person through what they're carrying. You can just be in the room. Renee was charged with forgery, filifying a fraudulent instrument, and real estate fraud, all felonies under Texas state law. The Deaf Smith County case was reopened. Fowler at the DA's office also connected her LLC structure to a third case, a cotton farm outside Plainview, where an elderly couple had lost 17 acres before their bank flagged the title irregularity. Renee had not been charged in that case because the connection hadn't been established. It was established now. Her Texas real estate consulting business was dissolved by court order pending trial. The two LLCs were frozen. Dolores, Renee's mother, was investigated for potential conspiracy. She was not charged. Prosecutors couldn't establish she'd known about the fraudulent filings specifically, though her phone call to me about estate planning was in the record. I don't know what that phone call cost her in terms of sleep. I hope it cost her something. The trial took 5 days. Renee's attorney argued good faith clerical error, miscommunication. He argued that Renee had genuinely believed she had Ben's authorization to act on behalf of the family estate. The jury did not find this credible. They deliberated for 4 hours. They came back with guilty on all 3 counts. The judge sentenced Renee to 9 years in state prison. She was 34 on the day she was sentenced. Ben filed for divorce 3 weeks after the arrest. He didn't do it angrily or dramatically. He drove to Adele's office, sat down, and said he wanted it done correctly and without spectacle, and Adele, who has handled everything correctly and without spectacle for 30 years, made sure that happened. The divorce was finalized in March. Grounds were fraud, specifically, material misrepresentation about intentions and character in inducing the marriage. Courts in Texas have seen this before. Ben moved back to the ranch for 7 months. He slept in his old room, drove his service truck out every morning, came home every evening. We watched football on Sunday afternoons. He helped me fix the fence on the north pasture, the same section I'd been checking when Sam called me in September. We didn't talk about Renee much. When we did, it was factual. How the case was progressing, what Adele said, what came next. One evening in January, he was sitting on the porch with his boots up on the railing. And he said, "Dad, I keep thinking about all the Sundays I drove out here, and she was in the truck with me, and she was doing math the whole time. On our land." I said, "Yeah." He said, "And I didn't see it." I said, "She was good at not being seen." He said, "You saw it." I said, "I had a reason to look that you didn't have yet." He was quiet. "What reason?" I said, "Your mother, she asked me to look." He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "That's a hell of a reason." I said, "It kept me paying attention for 2 years. It was enough." He got a new place in Amarillo in the spring. A house this time. Something with a yard. Something with enough room that a person could put down some roots if the right things happened. On the day he moved, he backed his truck up to the porch, loaded the last box, and stood there for a second, the way he does when he's got something to say, and he's deciding whether to say it. He said, "I'm going to be smarter next time." I said, "You were never stupid the first time. You just trusted a person who'd spent years learning how to be trusted." He looked at me. "Is there a difference?" I said, "A real one. Don't let her make you into someone who can't trust." He nodded. Then he got in his truck and drove away down the long gravel drive, and I watched until the dust settled. The land is still mine. All 340 acres. The trust remains in place. Adele reviews it every 2 years and pronounces it solid. The north pasture fence held through the winter. The barn got a new roof in April, something I'd been putting off for 3 years and finally stopped putting off. The cattle are fine. The winter wheat is in. There is a framed photograph on the wall of my kitchen, my grandfather standing in front of the original farmhouse in 1944, young, squinting into the sun, hand resting on a fence post that I can still touch if I walk 40 steps out the back door. 3 generations of people who got up early and paid their debts and didn't ask for anything that wasn't theirs. Renee Calloway looked at that land and saw a number. That was her mistake. Not the fraud, not the forged signature, not the shell LLCs. Those were just the mechanics of the mistake. The mistake was looking at 3 generations of something real and seeing only what it could be converted into. Some people look at a quiet man on a working ranch and think they're looking at someone who's not paying attention. They see the boots and the fence posts and the early bedtime, and they make a calculation. They're always wrong about that calculation, but by the time they find out, the file is already 53 pages long, and there's a ranger parked at the end of the drive. If you found this story worthwhile, hit that like button and subscribe. There are more stories where this one came from, and every one of them ends the same way, with the patient people still standing on their own land.